This is Law of the Land with Gloria, J. Browne-Marshall, on WBAI 99.5 FM, WBAI.org. Today we have two generations of civil rights on our show, the late James Forman Sr. and his son, the author, law professor, James Forman Jr. We'll be talking with him regarding his book, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. What is so fascinating about this particular show, as you know, we're here to enlighten and empower, is the generational perspective. And I like the generational perspective because we gain so much from our elders and from what we've learned from generations past. I really admire my elders, and I learn so much from younger generations as well. In this particular instance, you probably don't recall James Forman Sr., but he was a powerhouse of the civil rights movement. James Forman Sr. of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was called a revolutionary. He was a tiger. He was someone not only as a member of the Black Panthers, so to go from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to the Black Panthers, who believed in violence, you can see that his philosophy of social change, the dynamic for empowering his community, the African American community, was very much on the cutting edge of what he believed was necessary to create change. He is quoted as saying, if we can't have a seat at the table, then we will knock the blanking legs off of it. He was someone who, in the New York area, for those who may recall, actually went to Riverside Church during church services, disrupted the church services, demanding reparations for African Americans, and stating one of the core causes of the racial oppression in America has been the white church. And after negotiations, Riverside Church, then predominantly, segregated in many ways, white church, decided that it would stop its segregationist ways and begin to embrace more diversity in the church membership, and also begin to do what we know it's famous for now, and that is to sponsor social uplift and social justice programs. And that was because of James Forman Sr. He wrote a book, an autobiography, titled The Making of a Black Revolutionary. The Making of a Black Revolutionary. So to go from there to James Forman Jr., his son, and the discussion we'll have with him regarding crime and justice, I believe is a fascinating journey you'll take with me. But for a moment, let's hear more from James Forman Sr. Now, he was in the 1960s, and during that time period, when there were so many civil rights leaders and other workers who were threatened with harm, bodily harm and assault by police, as well as by members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white terrorists. But he, and so many of those young people, black, white, and those people who were leading the Latino movements and other movements, were fearless in their desire for equal rights under law. And most of us, we discussed the Voting Rights Act. And as you know, my book, The Voting Rights War, follows the NAACP and its fight for voting rights. But when you hear from the person who was at the table at the time, someone like James Forman Sr., to understand what it was like back then, you begin to better appreciate the rights that we have today. All the generational perspectives need to understand those fierce advocates for justice. So let's listen to James Foreman Sr. for a moment.
During the summer project of 1964, there was a meeting in Senator Javits, a senator from New York, in his home, in his apartment in New York City. Roy Wilkins was there. He's a good friend of mine. He's written some telegram in terms of when I was awarded the Roosevelt Key Award from Roosevelt University. He was there. It was during the course of the summer project. He objected to the summer project. He objected to a coalition of forces going into Mississippi. And he objected because he kept saying, well, you have to work on Mississippi from the outside. And I said, well, look, change is not going to come just from the outside struggle. You have to go inside. And so it's not a question of ridiculing, but kept objecting to what we were doing inside the state of Mississippi because he felt that you had to work on Mississippi from the outside. This raises a theoretical question, which is very important, is how does change occur? I mean, can you always change something from working from the outside of it? Or do you have to go inside? And our position was that you had to work on the inside of Mississippi as well as to have propaganda forms on the outside. And that so that's an example of someone objecting. A lot of the other leaders didn't quite understand, what it is that we were doing, but, our actions inside of Mississippi and other southern states led to the 1964, helped to lead to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And where President Lyndon Johnson signed that act, I was in the White House when he signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
And James Foreman Sr. discussing the 1964 Civil Rights Act and what it took. We take for granted that if there's discrimination on our job, that we have the ability to bring some type of action. But there was a time in which individual discrimination was not against the law. Can you believe this? Yes. Before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, only governmental discrimination was a cause of action. And that was if the governmental agent was acting under color of state law. Then an action could be brought, or an action could be brought under federal law. But individuals who discriminated against other individuals could not have any claims brought against them for discrimination. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which brought us not just protection against discrimination based on race, but also on color, on national origin, and of course on gender. And we will have a program in the near future on what happened with that, the issue of gender discrimination, and how women who were included in the 1964 Civil Rights Act in order to try to stop it from being passed ended up benefiting so much from the 1964 Civil Rights Act that you rarely even hear them discussing it anymore. And we have to talk about our sisters and what is happening and what they could be doing as far as helping others through this process that we're going through right now of discrimination that continues despite law. So that was James Foreman Sr., as I said, the author of, and this is a book I have, and I haven't read it yet, The Making of a Black Revolutionary. He died in 2005 at age 76. Remember, listen, he was talking about Senator Javits. Now we know the Javits Center. We forget the people behind the scenes who are the ones who gave us the foundation upon which we stand. He was discussing Roy Wilkins, who has a relative now who is now a federal judge, and everything has gone forward, but without understanding the past. Sankofa. Without understanding our past, we can't understand the present situation we're in, nor can we plan for the future. In a moment, we'll be back with an interview with James Foreman Jr., the son of the civil rights icon, and his book, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. Only the young. We're talking about these intergenerational issues of power, change, freedom, the vision of the future and the vision of the future of James Foreman Sr. And now, as we know, we have the son before us writing this great book, Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America. Thank you for joining us, James Foreman.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, you have been on the road, I'm sure, because it was so difficult for us to book you on this show. But we're so proud to have you and glad to have this conversation. And on Law of the Land, we talk about legal issues, but we're talking about them from a standpoint of empowerment as well as to better understand our past. And from the perspective of Sankofa, you can't understand your present if you don't understand the past. And so your book focuses on something that happened in our past, which is, of course, that at some point, the fearless freedom fighters like your father handed over the future of our community, and it seems that we didn't do the greatest job with it. Why don't you tell us more about your perspective in this book?
Absolutely. I mean, my perspective really grew out of the history that you just mentioned. You know, I grew up, both my parents were in SNCC. I mean, my dad was the one that, you know, everybody knows because of his leadership position as executive secretary. But my mom was also a member of the organization, and they were an interracial couple, you know, at a time when that was illegal in many states in this country. And I, as a child of the movement in a very real sense, had seen the dramatic progress that generation made. You know, when I had opportunities as an African-American man that were unheard of for my father's generation, unheard of for somebody like him who grew up under Jim Crow. So I got the chance to go to Yale Law School, and then I was clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and I became a public defender in Washington, D.C. And at the same time as I knew that so many in my generation had benefited in that way, it was also clear to me that a lot of folks in my community, you know, I grew up in a working class African-American neighborhood in Atlanta, and many of my classmates from high school, you know, didn't make it. And when you looked at, you know, in the neighborhood that I lived in, we had two huge buildings. We had a penitentiary and a Ford plant when I was a child, two huge institutions. And by the time I graduated from law school, the penitentiary had added a wing and the Ford plant was closed. And that was just, to me, a kind of a testament to what was happening in the country. So I chose to become a public defender because I wanted to fight for what seemed to me to be the civil rights issue of my generation, keeping black men and women, black boys and girls, mostly, that's what we had in D.C., out of the criminal justice system. And when I got to D.C., where my dad lived, one of the things that I saw and I was exposed to was there was a lot of African-American representation. And I had known this in Atlanta, but I was a child, and so I wasn't really really kind of paying attention. But when I became a professional and I would go to court, you know, I'd have cases where my client was African-American, but the judges, you know, 40% of the judges in D.C. are African-American. The prosecutors, a lower percentage, but they often were. The juries in our cases, the police force in D.C. is majority black. The police chief, when I was there, was African-American. Now he's not at the moment, but was for 30 years. And yet we were doing, and this is really the book, the question of the book, we were doing in a majority African-American community with a lot of black elected officials, we were doing many of the same harsh and punitive and counterproductive things to our community as I was seeing around the country. So 1 in 3, a lot of people know the number, 1 in 3 young black men is under criminal justice supervision. That's a number that came out actually starting in the early 90s from a great organization called the Sentencing Project. But in D.C., it's 1 in 2. And so this question of kind of how did we end up kind of going along, right, with the country? How did this leadership class and civil service, you know, the bureaucracy, the probation officers, the police officers, the prosecutors, how did we end up going along with this nationwide kind of push to lock up more people. That was really what I was trying to grapple with in the book, and I felt like that story hadn't been told. I felt like we hadn't really gone back into history to the 60s, the 70s, 80s, to the origins of the war on drugs and other things, and ask, what was the involvement of the black community then, and also going forward, and I know we'll get to this probably later in the conversation, but what can we do now? Because things are different somewhat now than when they were 40, 50 years ago.
Oh, so let's then break it down to the war on drugs.
Okay.
So when Nixon declares this war on drugs, and I'm quite sure you're familiar with the fact that this conversation with Haldeman, in which he basically says we made up the culprit of African Americans and white hippies as those people who were the culprits, so therefore we could use the media to demonize them, and then the rest of the country would go along with the demonization once it's been done on the nightly news night after night. And so now that we have this war on drugs that's been officially declared from the White House down, and the resources of the country, state, local, and federal criminal justice resources are now put forward for this war on drugs. And they've identified white hippies and the black community as the culprits for this, the enemy in the war on drugs. I'm looking back now at the 60s and 70s and going forward. Something else happened in particular that you touch on a little bit, especially given the fact that you clerked for Sandra Day O'Connor on the U.S. Supreme Court, that there was also a seat change with the court. And I think it's like chapter 5 of your book, you discussed this whole stop and frisk. But going back to Terry versus Ohio, when we changed the composition of the court, we bring on Justice White and other law and order justices. We're away from the Brown court. And now we're moved into the uprisings of the 1960s are giving rise to this sense that the exclusionary rule, which, as you know, as a professor at Yale Law School, is this controversial rule that's still controversial today, that you can exclude evidence that's been obtained by police unconstitutionally through, the duplicitous means, unconstitutional ways in which to get information. There's this sea change now that we have to discuss in the war on drugs, in which it's thought that the Supreme Court has to play a role. And Terry versus Ohio in 1968 is a part of that role. And how do you figure this in? Because I know it's in your book. How do you figure this in, this sea change that's taking place in the way we look at the African American community, not just as African Americans, but as the country as a whole?
Right. So you're right. There's a political story, right, and there's a legal story. The political story is the one that you identified, which is where you have people like Nixon advisor Haldeman saying exactly what you just said he said, and also going further and saying we're going to talk about crime because we can't talk about race anymore. But when we talk about crime, that white voter that we're appealing to knows that we're actually talking about black people. And so they were very explicit, right, that this idea of these coded racial appeals, and, Michelle Alexander, Brian Stevenson, other people write about this, in their work. This was the plan. And then legally, the Supreme Court is, kind of going back and forth on criminal law, criminal justice issues in the 60s. There are some rulings that are positive in terms of the right to counsel, in terms of, the right against self-incrimination, right? There are some very worthwhile decisions. They haven't been executed to this day to their full potential or close to it, so they haven't changed the landscape of what it's like to be charged with a crime when you're poor enough, but they were steps in the right direction. But then you also have, at the same time, you have things like the Terry versus Ohio, which you cited, which basically authorized, although I don't know that the court knew how it would be exploited in the decades to come, but it authorized the stop and frisk program that we would see in later years in New York City, and it authorized in cases like it authorized the vehicle stops and searches that I write about in, chapter 6 of the book. So there's a political move in the 60s and early 70s to capitalize on rising crime, to gin up fear, and to try to persuade voters, black and white, but mainly white and other races, that now is the time to get tough. And then you have the court authorizing some of that with its decisions. So all of that is happening, right? And so for me, that's like the backdrop. That's the national story. And then I'm trying to ask the question, well, what are black elected officials doing within that, right? Because mine is a story that's both a story of agency, and it's also a story of constraints, right? So they're constrained by these national forces, but then what are they doing with their power within that? And so one of the things that I write about is marijuana decriminalization in the 1970s, which was a big issue around the country. People have kind of forgotten it today that was happening in the 70s. I didn't realize this until I went back and did my story. I thought marijuana decriminalization was an issue of the last 4 or 5 years, but it really was first pushed in the 70s. And in D.C., the opposition to marijuana decriminalization mainly came from black ministers, the black church, which was even more politically powerful force then than it is now, although it still has power, and a black nationalist city council member by the name of Doug Moore. But what was fascinating to me is that they didn't oppose marijuana decriminalization because they didn't care about black people, right? That wasn't their rationale in the way that, for example, Nixon, right? He didn't say it, but would have been his rationale, right? He didn't have the interest of the black community at heart. But these are individuals who do, in many respects, care about black people, black progress. They're African American themselves, and they're elected with that mindset in the case of Doug Moore, or the ministers with that mindset in the case of the ministers. But they still oppose decriminalization, even though marijuana criminalization was so devastating for black Americans, and they oppose it in part because they're fearful of heroin. They're fearful of marijuana as a gateway drug. They've adopted that mindset. They're also worried about black youth using marijuana and getting high because they feel like, you know what, our kids have to be twice as good. They have to be twice as ready for school. They have to be twice as on the straight and narrow because of racism, because of the way racism has held us back as a community. We can't be out there getting high. And then from the black left, and this was what was fascinating to me, right? You have people like Stokely Carmichael and others who are saying drugs are a trick of the oppressor, right? And yes, the white man is bringing drugs into this country, but it's black men that are selling drugs on the corner. And we don't know if we can do anything about the international cartels, but what we can do is we can police ourselves. We can say to the young brother on the corner, no. You got to get out of our neighborhood with this stuff. And that was a really strong message at the time. So you have all of these forces, and that was, I guess to me, what was so fascinating was to learn about these other forces that were going alongside the Nixons and the Haldemans and the Terry versus Ohios that were driving in many ways towards the same outcome, although often with different motivations.
We're talking with James Foreman, Jr., author of Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. This is WBAI 99.5 FM, WBAI.org. Gloria Browne-Marshall here and having this fantastic conversation. Now, I have to give you full disclosure, okay? So
All
this
right.
is just between the two of us. No one else is listening. But, so I want you to know that my background is a civil rights attorney. And that I did work at not at Legal Aid but Legal Services. So yes, in addition to other civil rights organizations. And my book, Race, Law, and American Society, has a chapter in it on crime and injustice. But I follow it from the 1600s going forward, looking at the ways in which the criminal justice laws were used to oppress the African American community, and especially after slavery and through the time period of Jim Crow, going into the present. And the reason why I give this background is because when the debate came up, for example, on marijuana, my concern when I was asked point blank at a speaking engagement at St. Philip's Church in Harlem, what did I think of the decriminalization of marijuana? My concern was that it was a trick.
Yes.
So
and what year was this? Can you tell me this?
No, this was just maybe 5 years ago.
Okay.
My concern was it was a trick, and I was looking at it from very much the perspective you've given. One, what are we saying to our young people? We're saying, okay, because I was walking down the street, I saw a young white woman standing on the corner talking to a girlfriend, smoking weed, whatever.
Right.
So it's so funny because when you hear white people smoke marijuana, black people smoke weed. So,
I know, right?
So I'm going to say she was smoking weed with her white self, with her cute little sundress on, standing on the corner, smoking weed, in Manhattan. And what really got me was I was saying, so if a brother is standing on the corner doing the exact same thing, what do we think this outcome is going to be? My concern is that even through the point of, certain states like, as you know, in Colorado and other places where it's decriminalized, that they would figure out some kind of way to not make it decriminalized for us.
Right.
My concern was the double standard of law. And I've had this paranoia about that. And that's why I said it's the core of my research. And my sense of American injustice is that what might be, even like right now, the opioid epidemic, where it was, our communities flooded with heroin. And there were no programs. No one was handing out kits to save us from overdosing. I've seen a record of the duplicitousness of criminal justice when it comes to communities of color. So I was probably one of those people who was not a fan of decriminalizing marijuana. I looked at it from the standpoint of I knew it would help our communities, but I still wanted to see the facts. Let's have someone like the Urban Institute actually analyze this to find out if this was actually applied fairly, how would it help our communities? And at the same time, really looking forward, how would they use it to harm our communities? And that second part hadn't been done. And that's why I was wary of decriminalization.
Right. Let me, and are we on air having this conversation?
Yes, but we're going to pretend that thousands of people aren't listening.
I understand because I'm really glad that you brought this up because I think there are so many people like you in the African American community. I'm really glad that you just came with it and shared your concerns because in my opinion, to understand what was going on in the 1970s, and then we can fast forward to today as well. We've always in our community, we've always been worried when you're dealing with drugs about kind of two things, right? The first is the use and the implications that has on the individual and on the community, right? What does it mean to be using drugs, to maybe get addicted, in the case of marijuana, possibly, again, going into this gateway. Jackie Robinson, the baseball star, in the 1970s, he was going around to black churches saying, don't decriminalize marijuana because it will lead to heroin. And the evidence that he gave was his son, Jackie Jr., who became a heroin addict. And Jackie Sr., the baseball great, says, my son started with marijuana. Now, when Jackie Robinson, especially in the early 70s, right, this is only a decade after, he was in the major leagues, is going around telling that kind of story, that resonates in black communities. So there's a fear of what the drugs will do. And then, on the other side, there's a fear of what the courts and the police and the criminal process will do. And there's this constant balancing, right, of trying to figure out which of these possible harms is worse.
That definitely, right? Definitely.
Which of these is worse? And in the 1970s, there was a majority view when they polled African Americans in D.C. on this question. A majority said they opposed legalization. The majority view was that the harms of the drugs outweighed the harms of the criminalization of the drugs. That view is shifting. In D.C., they reconsidered in 2014. They took up the same decriminalization law that they had rejected in 1975. And this time it passed. And it passed because we had now had 40 years of evidence of what the harms of the criminalization was going to look like. Right? We knew about the lost jobs, the inability to get student loans, the careers that are shortened or truncated. I tell a story in my book of a woman, Sandra Dozier, who loses her job, and I hope we have a chance to talk about this, stop and frisk, who loses her job even though over marijuana because she was a probationary employee, and they had a rule that you can't be arrested for any offense while you're on probation. So that evidence has mounted for 40 years, and I think today the majority view, not everybody, because clearly you express your concerns, but the majority view is that the harms of criminalization are so great that they outweigh the harms of the use. Or another way of thinking about it is we have to find another way to keep drug use down. Right? Nobody that I know that supports decriminalization of drugs says, well, I think it's a good thing to use them. But instead they say we have to have strategies to keep people off drugs to begin with, especially kids, and to keep them from becoming addicted as adults, that other than policing and prosecution and prisons. And I hear you about the double standard, right? That's right. The problem is that having something be criminalized is what gives the police the maximum authority to exert that double standard. If the drug was not criminal, then the police wouldn't have, and I know you know this, the police wouldn't have the authority to stop the young brother with the weed that they see smoking it. So you're right, they still might try to find a way. We know this. But it takes away one excuse or one thing from their arsenal of bringing somebody into the criminal legal system. And that seems to me what we need to be focused on in the next kind of 10 years as we think about kind of reform is how can we reduce the ways in which, the number of ways in which people can get brought into the criminal system. And that's got to be our goal. And
that brings me to my next question. My next question, and I've irritated many judges. I didn't clerk for a U.S. Supreme Court justice, but I did clerk for a state court judge as well as a federal trial court judge, and I clerked for a black judge, a black Republican. That's another story for another show. But one thing I found fascinating is the conservativeness of the black community. And and most people don't understand that the African American community is quite conservative. And these issues of justice, to me, are not liberal issues. They fall within the realm of human experience in which one should be treated equally under law. But because there's this advocacy around fighting for justice and fighting against injustice, the community itself is seen as a broader, more liberal community than it actually is. Having said that, we start off with a conservative community, and then we have black judges, black prosecutors, police officers who are now in these positions, as you pointed out, not just in Washington, D.C., but in positions of power across the country. But here's the concern I have. They're still in positions in which law enforcement is enforcing laws that have a racial bias to them. Going back to what was said before, the power to incarcerate people of color in a way that's disparate to their number is based deeply in Jim Crow and post-slavery laws and that were put in place at the time, and the convict lease system. And so even though we have more people of color in these positions, they're still in the position to only enforce the laws that are already in place. So they have conservatism. Now we have them in these positions in which they have the title but not the power, and the power they do have is to enforce what is already there, which is not to the benefit of the African American community.
Well, you really summed up really brilliantly there the dilemma, right? And the dilemma of representation, right? What does it mean to achieve representation in an unjust system? And I think, in some ways that, that could be that's the story. That could be the title of the book in another sense. So I want to pick up on 2 points. The first is you talked about the conservatism, and I'm glad you raised that, because one thing was really important to me in this book, and I haven't really talked about it that much in kind of conversations about it, but it matters so much to me, is I feel like our portrayals of the black community in kind of popular discourse, they always get flattened out to a single point of view or a single perspective. And I really wanted to write something that presented the rich ideological and political diversity, like the debates within black America that were taking place, and in all of their nuance and complexity and different positions, the ministers ending up on the same side as the black nationalists against the traditional civil rights leaders, those kinds of tensions that, again, they're not surprising to black people. Black people read this and they're like, yeah, that's like my family, that's Thanksgiving dinner.
Thanksgiving dinner. I was just going to say that, where you have all these generational perspectives and people from different parts of the country and lived experiences as well.
But it's not known out beyond, right? It's not broadly known. It's not known much outside the black community. And so I really wanted, and so one thing that I sometimes kind of chafe against is because the people that were pushing for laws won most of the debates, that I describe in the book, there's a way in which you can kind of thinly summarize the book, and it makes it sound as if what I'm really writing about is just sort of black people who wanted tough criminal laws, when really all along the way I'm writing about the tensions and the debates, and the other side is represented, the people that were pushing for decriminalization, their arguments get an airing. The people that were against mandatory minimums, they lose, but why were they? So that's really important to me. I don't think we have enough kind of rich political, social, intellectual histories, especially of kind of recent decades. So, but then you also move to this question of, okay, so what about the structures that they move into? So yeah, we get black representatives, but they still are enforcing laws that have the history that you just described, and I think that's right. And I think that one of the tragedies of the book is you see the ways in which the kind of dream of representation, the dream of kind of having our people in office, having people who look like us on the police force, on the city council. It matters. It really does. I believe this. As a black child growing up in Atlanta, where I would look at the newspaper every morning and see, a black city council making decisions, that is significant.
Well,
it really does matter.
But I also want to, and we're talking with James Foreman. He's discussing his book, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. You need to get this book. One of the other parts of that, so on the one hand is the sense of pride. Oh, wow, we have a person of color, an African American who's on city council, who's running for mayor. Then the other is some horrible crime happens and everybody holds their breath. Please let his name not be Leon Jones. It's like you look at it like, please not to, and I'm quite sure Latino community feels the same way. It's like, you're waiting for that last name to figure out if this is going to be somebody who's also bringing embarrassment to your community. And that's something else that people don't know, that the African American community is embarrassed when people are arrested for these particular crimes and they are of African descent. I mean, but there's another one very quickly that I want to go into, this other dynamic. And for those people who do want to ask him a question, some lucky caller will be able to ask James Foreman a question about this. And the call-in number is 347-335-0818. Once again, that's 347-335-0818. That call in for this very, very unique opportunity to ask him a question regarding crime and punishment in the black community and the way it was viewed in the issue of classism. We have not discussed this issue of classism and this idea that that black politicians, black prosecutors using prosecutorial discretion, this sense that education has taken them to a particular level and that they are representing the community at a middle class level, and this embarrassment almost of the black suspect. And, you know, as you pointed out with the judge who's chastising young offenders and giving them the riot act over what Martin Luther King had fought for, there's this issue of classism because now you're following the rise of the black middle class. I mean, there had been a black middle class. It had been much smaller from the 1800s, but now we have this dynamic rise in the black middle class that seems to also figure in. Tell us a little bit about that. And we're going to take a call in about 2 seconds after you've told us about the class aspect.
I think it's exactly right. Everything you said is exactly right. So just the story, you mentioned the story about the judge, right? So there's the book opens with a story of a judge. I'm representing a young man by the name of Brandon. I call him Brandon. I changed everybody's names in the book, and he's facing sentencing for possession of a gun and small amount of marijuana. And in this case, the prosecutor happens to be African American. She's asking for him to be locked up. The judge is African American. He has to make the decision, and he reads Brandon this. He gives him this Martin Luther King speech about what King fought and died for. And then he locks him up. And I use that as a way into kind of the dilemma of this book, right? Here we have all these African Americans in the courtroom, and the net result for Brandon is the same. But here's another way of thinking about the class story. Everybody in that courtroom was similar in that we were all African American, but there was a class difference between everybody and Brandon, right? In a way, you could think of the prosecutor and the judge and myself as, you know, we are all educated, all had gone to law school. Now, whether we grew up poor or not, we now were middle class. And in a way, some of the story of what's going on in black communities on this issue, and as you said, it's not just D.C., it's Atlanta, it's Detroit, it's Jackson. I just got an email from a public defender in Jackson, Mississippi, who said, wow, your book, it's like my experience. I go to court, there's black judges, black prosecutors, and my clients are just catch hell every day. And the fact is that we haven't really come to terms with are some of the distaste that people in our community have for those who they see as not having lived up to their potential, those that they see as holding us back, those that they see as unwilling or unable to take advantage of the opportunities that America is providing, those that they see as unwilling to kind of live up to Dr. King's dream. I mean, and these are some, you know, one of the people I quote Jesse Jackson. This is in the 80s. He's in Birmingham, Alabama, in a jail, and he's meeting with some prisoners, and one woman walks up to him, and she has a picture of Dr. King. She's wearing a shirt with Dr. King on it. And he says, don't wear that shirt. If you believed in Dr. King, if he was your hero, you wouldn't be here. Now, I have much love and much respect for much of what Jesse Jackson has done in his life, and I'm not trying to single him out, you know, or belittle him in any way. I'm just trying to point to how that has kind of become part of many people's consciousness, this sense that if you really were holding yourself upright, you wouldn't be in the criminal system.
Oh, and with that, I want to bring in our caller. And you're on the air with James Foreman Jr. discussing his book, Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America. Go ahead.
Hi. It's so many areas that this conversation is going. It's kind of like being not on a roller coaster, but like on some type of outer space ride where you go up, down, in, outside circle, and then implode, explode. It's crazy. Okay, because what got me angry and what made me dial the phone as furiously as I could was when I heard some people think when one person does wrong, it's an embarrassment to the black community. I used to hear that growing up. My family came from the South. I grew up hearing that crap. I'm not responsible as what some people do wrong, and I don't take credit as what some people do right. I think we all working on a problem, and I heard things like, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. That's what I like, because it's divisive when you single out someone who's doing better, but they're not doing enough, or when you single out somebody who make a mistake, so they make it bad for everybody. Just like earlier, when they had the person getting some kind of award or medal, and find out 2017 it was based on so-called white supremacy that this medal was given out. And maybe the joke was, oh, well, you're one of the good Negroes, you're a credit to your race, so we will give you one of our white supremacy awards. Because all these statues now being knocked down, rightfully so and appropriately so, is because no one cared about that stuff 2017, and now they're looking at it. But back then, people had to live with that stuff, and they had to just suck it up and keep moving. We're coming from all kind of directions, but we all have to fight the power. And I believe what it starts with, by any means necessary for freedom, justice, and equality. And how can you find justice in an unjust system? We have to stay together in unity. And if we stay focused, what we can do to get forward, we appreciate each other. We don't talk about each other. We just do better and leave it at that.
And that was well said by our listener. Any comment, Mr. Foreman?
Just that I agree. I'm glad she called in, and I'm glad that she said that. I especially resonate with me this idea of you've got to, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, and this idea that even in as difficult as it seems sometimes in our community to try to be unified and to try to lift each other up, we cannot forget that part of our tradition. Right? That's always been a part of the African American tradition. It's part of what's kept us alive in this country, that has tried to take our lives so many times, and that has succeeded at times. But that spirit of resistance and that spirit of unity in the darkest hour has kept us here, and has kept us thriving at these times in these moments where we are thriving. So thank you for that comment. I couldn't agree more.
And I want to, just as we close now, raise two things that, of course, take far more time than we have. This outlandish issue of black-on-black crime. And this sense that we all know or should know that when people hurt other people, those are usually people within arm's reach, within their own communities. So you have Asian on Asian crime and you have white on white crime. But this whole sense that this very unique thing, this black on black crime, is supposed to be more violent and more prevalent than any other type of crime. And therefore it requires more criminal action. That is something I think other communities, as well as the black community, that they're fed into, that there's a belief that there's such a thing as just black on black crime as opposed to any other ethnicity or racial group, and that it requires more policing than any other type of criminal issue.
Yeah, we have definitely, these days I think there's people recognize the point that you just made and are really pushing against that concept, right, as even being a meaningful one. But it was an idea that in some ways originated in the black community. If readers pick up the book, they should look at page 138, because on page 138 I have a full page.
Yes, I saw that, and I wish I had. But I wish I had more time to talk about that, because did that begin with the black publication, or were they actually continuing a conversation that began before that publication?
Well, I tried to really sort through that, and I didn't write about it because it was a little bit murky. I wouldn't say that we were the first, but it was definitely true that, that ebony cover that has black on black crime, that's the most bold, I found references or kind of uses of the term, but not a lot. So I do think that we were kind of fairly early on. But here's what I want to say, though. when you actually look in the issue and you look at what they say, a lot of the first use of the term black-on-black crime was in many ways from a progressive mentality of trying to say, listen, we need to deal with income inequality, right? We need to deal with racism. We need to get better housing. Like, so when you look at the causes and the cures that they identify, it's not just more police. See, what happened was, so this is an example of a sort of a complex term that was used in context. Then over time, when it gets lifted out of the black community, it then becomes like a hammer that white conservatives, black-on-black crime, right, even to this day with Trump and Sessions, they use it as a way basically of kind of demonizing the black community. So I guess I would say I think the black publications and black columnists in the early 70s, some of the first people to use the phrase that I can find were African-American columnists in Chicago newspapers and Pittsburgh newspapers. But they weren't always using it to just say more police, more prosecutors, more prisons. That's how it got, when it got kind of co-opted, that's how it got transformed.
And we have had a great conversation with James Foreman, Jr., son of the civil rights icon, James Foreman, Sr. James Foreman, Jr. is author of Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America. He is a professor at Yale Law School. He's written for the New York Times and the Atlantic, clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and has spent time on Law of the Land with you and me. Thank you so much, James, for joining us.
Thank you. I really appreciate the conversation.
This is WBAI 99.5 FM, WBAI.org, Law of the Land with Gloria J. Browne-Marshall. And you know, I'll see you on the radio.
Breeze drifting on by, you know how I feel.